Okay, well, I thank you for your patience. This happened last week as well, in which we had to scramble for chairs. We have 37 chairs already in the room, so we must have got another 20 or so already. It's quite pleasing to have a good attendance. And especially for this talk tonight, which I'll introduce Jim Hornby in a moment. My name is Doug Sobey. I'm the president of the Bedeck Area Historical Society, and we have been organizing these talks for about 5 years now, and this year we have 8 talks scheduled right through to the end of August. We didn't go for 8 initially, but we had add-ons which we thought important to include. This evening's talk is funded by an anti-racism microgrant or awarded by the Anti-Racism Table of the Prince Edward Island Government. And in January, when the grant applications were open, I thought it would be quite useful for us to apply for it, because the topic that one of the main topics of our museum, one of the main areas of coverage, is the Loyalist settlement of Prince Edward Island. And as we know from historical documents, it was that period in the 1780s and 90s when there was the introduction of enslaved people to Prince Edward Island by a few of the Loyalists, and also by military officers who were being disbanded at the time. And so we applied, and we received it. And there are 2 aspects. It funds this talk tonight, and it also enabled us to create a poster panel, which is behind me here, which we'll unveil, which will become a permanent part of the museum's collection. So without much further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. Jim Hornby. Jim is a native of Charlottetown and now a resident of Mount Herbert, which is not very far from Charlottetown. He is a folklorist, a fiddle player, an historian, and for his career, a lawyer. And also he's got here a grandfather as well, so that's probably his principal interest at the moment. Jim has an MA in Canadian and Modern Literature from Concordia University, an MA in Folklore from Memorial University of Newfoundland, and a law degree from Dalhousie. He is a past editor of the Island magazine and the author of articles on island history, folklore, and traditional music. He is the author of several books, one called Pomme de Terre, and of In the Shadow of the Gallows. And what is most relevant to tonight's talk, he is the author of Black Islanders, which was published by the Institute of Island Studies in 1991. So that's over 30 years ago. And it was the only study, and at that time, and really the only study to date that has looked at all of the documentation in detail on the historical black community on Prince Edward Island, which the community which dates back to the 1700s. And it is on this subject that Jim Hornby is going to talk to us tonight. And if I had a long arm, I would change the slide, but I'll change it in a moment. Under the title of Loyalists and Slaves on the Island of St. John, 1784 and after. So we welcome Jim to speak to us tonight. So, and then we'll attach this to your lapel. So somewhere where... Just speak.
Hello, hello. Good. Can you hear me? I'm used to performing acoustically, but this will work. If you can hear me, that's great.
And I will just change the slide here, but that's a minor change. So carry on, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much. It's wonderful to see such a large and bright and interested audience here on this July evening. It's wonderful to be here with you. As part of marking the 240th anniversary of Loyalists arriving in Quebec, I'm being given the opportunity this evening to use my research on the island's black history to speak to you about the reintroduction here during the 1780s of enslaved persons of African or African American heritage. And my thanks to Doug Sobey for this invitation. I say reintroduction because black slaves had come and gone on this island with the French regime when it was known as Ile Saint-Jean during the period 1719 to 1745. The island's historic black population, whose descendants remain with us today, arrived following the American Revolution, and they were brought here by Loyalists and disbanded troops on the losing side who had to leave what became the United States of America. Having captured the island of St. John in 1758 during the 7 Years' War, which was formally ceded to Britain with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the British recognized the island of St. John as a colony separate from Nova Scotia in 1769 and sent out Governor Walter Patterson as its chief administrator in 1770. Walter Patterson was a slaveholder himself, although it's not clear during what periods. I don't believe he brought slaves with him, but he had a male slave and a female slave while he was here as governor at some periods. Patterson was attuned to the fact that the war had not gone well for the British side, and it was clear well before it was over that there would be a number of people, Loyalists, who remained loyal to the British Crown, who would need to be evacuated and resettled. And they were intended to be relocated to the nearest British territory, which for those who were Americans who were on the eastern seaboard, which was probably the majority, the Maritime provinces were the closest area to send them to after the war. One of Governor Patterson's first ordinances after he got here, the year after he got here in 1771, restricting departures from the island by ship appears to include slaves, if you would look at it a little bit closely. One result of the situation that Patterson found himself in is that he put a piece of legislation through the legislature of the island of St. John in 1781, several years before the Revolutionary War ended, which belongs in a Canadian Hall of Shame for embarrassing legislation. The short form of it is the Baptism of Slaves Act, and it was quite simply an invitation to Loyalists who are looking for new places to relocate in British territory, and to let them know that they and their slaves were welcome to the island of St. John. This act, the Baptism of Slaves Act, was modeled on early plantation state legislation, particularly from Virginia. Its like is not found in any other Canadian jurisdiction, including many places such as Nova Scotia, where they had many more slaves arrive than we did here. While slavery was recognized as a fact of life in some colonial legislation under the British Empire, it did not require specific authority in any part of the British Empire. It was quite simply part of the common law of property ownership. And the fact that slaves had been considered property for many years was not something that judges or anyone in the late 18th century was prepared to go back and look at, because at that time there was certainly nothing in the order of universal human rights legislation. So it was, slaves had been treated as property, and it was as property that they stayed until legislation changed that. the Baptism of Slaves Act recognized the existence of slavery for quote-unquote Negroes and set out some rules that all persons born to female slaves would be enslaved at their birth and belong to the same master who owned the woman giving birth. That baptism of slaves, as the title suggests, did not release them from slavery. They wanted to be quite sure that if you became a Christian, you were still going to be a slave. That wasn't going to change anything. And the word mulattoes is used in the Act, which indicates that mixed race people of color are included in the Act and are eligible as slaves. However, while legislation about slaves could be imported and was imported by Governor Patterson, the conditions under which slavery flourished in southern climates could not be imported. Rather than fields of rice, tobacco, and cotton needing to be harvested, the settlers on the island of St. John were faced with endless virgin forest needing to be cleared before any farming could be started. It took a lot of time and effort to remove those forest giants. So we were not really set up for large groups of enslaved people working together in fields. The present-day Maritimes, as I said, were the closest British colonies to the eastern seaboard, and many migrating Loyalist families and former soldiers were offered land. The British wanted to resettle them as close to America as possible, and they were originally offered land at Shelburne, Nova Scotia, the southwestern part, and many were evacuated from New York City in 1783 to Shelburne as refugees. And Governor Patterson, they were offered land at Shelburne and then later at St. John, New Brunswick. Governor Patterson, who was aware of these movements, issued a proclamation of welcome and offer of land on the island to those land-seeking refugees in Shelburne in October 1783. And subsequently, as a result of his proclamation, a number of Loyalist families and family groups arrived here in response, and thereafter through personal connections or happenstance. In particular, Bedeque received and no doubt welcomed a substantial number of Loyalist families who are commemorated on Bedeque's noteworthy Loyalist Memorial Cairn. I will later speak of several slaves associated with Loyalists in this area, but perhaps what is most striking is how few of this group brought slaves. I have a grand total of 2 certain and 2 possible enslaved persons associated with Bedeque area and Lot 26 area Loyalists, who I'll speak of later as a small group. However, slaves were not numerous generally on Prince Edward Island. They were people. They were sort of belonging to the elite and well-to-do, and were sort of flaunted, I think, as indications of how prosperous they were if they could afford to bring a slave with the possessions they were able to take from America. Most of those who could do that owned their own ships to do that. So they belonged to the elite and well-to-do, a small group initially, which included some Loyalists. And I should point out as a result that the term island loyalist should not, in general, contain any connotation that they were slave owners. Some were, but many weren't. Now, I will speak tonight about slave-owning island loyalists and some of the enslaved persons whom they brought here in 3 groups. Firstly, prominent island loyalists. Secondly, loyalists from Rhode Island. And thirdly, Loyalists associated with Bedeque and Lot 26. Can we call them the Bedeque area Loyalist catchment? I don't know. Anyway, firstly, the relatively prominent and well-to-do war refugees. First and foremost, Edmund Fanning, the second governor, lieutenant governor of the island, prominent North Carolina royalist, the location of whose former home in Hillsborough, North Carolina, which was destroyed by some rebellious neighbors, is the site of a North Carolina historic site marker. Not long ago, a Yale and Slavery project gave a report from that prominent American university which showed that slaves had worked on buildings at Yale. A number of other universities have sort of done inventories on their connection to slavery. One of them that has been very useful to me was the Brown University in Rhode Island, and done a wonderful piece on slavery there. And even Dalhousie University in Halifax has done some checking into its own past. But getting back to Yale, Edmund Fanning, very active in the Revolutionary War on the Royalist side. He led a regiment that became the King's American Regiment. And as son-in-law and military associate of New York Governor William Tryon, whose name is found in a number of places not far from here, Fanning prevailed upon Tryon in July 1779 to cancel a British plan to burn down the rebel town of New Haven, Connecticut, which they had at that time in the war the power to do. But Fanning basically talked them out of doing that, and as a result of his efforts, in 1803, Yale awarded Edmund Fanning an honorary doctorate of laws in appreciation. I might mention that that one of Edmund Fanning's daughters, I believe one who was born on the island, she was named Margaret William Tryon Fanning. So he was a fan. In recognition of his service to the British cause, Fanning was first made Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia under John Parr, and then succeeded Governor Patterson as Chief Executive of the Island of St. John, albeit while retaining the title Lieutenant Governor, which he had had in Nova Scotia. So our Chief Administrators for the Crown have subsequently, and up to today, been Lieutenant Governor. When he arrived here in 1786, Fanning brought a number of slaves, including 3 couples. They were David and Keziah Shepherd, Joseph and Hannah Carpenter, who unusually, here at this place in time, were of East Indian rather than African ancestry, but they were still enslaved, and John Bass and Margaret Dixon. So Fanning brought 3 couples, and perhaps setting an example in using the Baptism of Slaves Act, he was the first person to have a slave baptized, a slave person baptized, and that was Benjamin Shepherd in 1789. Benjamin Shepherd would eventually lead his family eastward to settle in Vernon River, from where his son, Edmund Shepherd, carried on the family's eastward migration to the Grand River Road area of Cardigan, where Edmund and his descendants made the most significant presence of any founding black family on the island. And to this day, I would say, I'm quite confident in saying that the Shepherd descendants are the most numerous descendants in the historical black population of this island. Secondly, in the prominent group, Joseph Robinson, a plantation owner at Broad River, South Carolina at the outbreak of the war. Like Fanning, he was a very active, whoops, there goes my foot, an active military leader, Lieutenant Colonel of the South Carolina Royalists Regiment. Robinson led 2,400 Loyalist troops at the Battle of 96 on November 22nd, 1775, the first land battle in the southern theater of the war. And after the war, Lieutenant Governor recruited him to be a very prominent person on the island here, receiving many high offices and properties from Fanning. Of course, as Lieutenant Governor, he was able to give away all the crown land that he wanted to, whoever he wanted to. And he got some himself, of course. Charity begins at home, I guess. Joseph Robinson brought here the first Byers couple, John and Amelia. John, at the early days, was known as Black Jack. And their son, William Byers, who was born in New Brunswick before they came over, with his family and possessions, as well as 2 enslaved males bearing his names, Caesar Robinson and Sancho Robinson. Descendants of the Byers couple had been the most prominent black family in Charlottetown since they arrived 240 years ago. Robinson is noteworthy among island slave owners in having slave quarters, quote unquote, on his home property, which was called Rosetta Farm and was located in York, Lot 34, south of the St. Peter's Road. It's identifiable in Meacham's Atlas 1880, although it doesn't have Rosetta Farm on the name, it has the owner's name. But that's the property that he had, and that's where he had separate quarters for his slaves, which were not that numerous. And of course, he didn't have any plantations for them to go out and work on at the farm either. The third of the higher-ranking Loyalists and slaveholders was Robert Gray, a Virginian who was born in Glasgow, Scotland, had been a captain in the King's American Regiment under Edmund Fanning, Lieutenant Colonel Fanning. After the war, Gray was evacuated to Shelburne and moved to the island of St. John in the summer of 1787 to accept a position as Fanning's personal secretary. They had been comrades in arms during the war. Like Robinson, he was given prime government positions and land lots by Edmund Fanning. Robert Gray is believed to have owned, or I've concluded he has owned, 3 slaves, although none appear to have left a family line here. Their names were Freelove Allen, John Allen, and Mary Amos. Fourthly, among the bigwigs, George Burns, Captain George Burns, is a Loyalist with an asterisk, if at all. He was well settled on the island in 1764, well before the American Revolution, a British officer who had fought in Cape Breton. However, he volunteered when the American Revolutionary War broke out, and he joined the Royal American Fencible Regiment of Foot, which was stationed at Fort Cumberland near the New Nova Scotia-New Brunswick border. And actually, it may sound remote from the war, Fort Cumberland, but they did have military activity there, including a siege. After the war, Captain Burns returned to his home on the island, apparently accompanied by 2 enslaved black men named Jupiter Wise and Joe. George Burns was a very well-connected man of the late 18th century here, who is now remembered mostly because of one slave he owned for perhaps less than 2 years, named Jupiter Wise. Jupiter Wise was the most colorful and audacious character among the slaves, or at least recorded among the slaves brought here by disbanded troops who, like Burns, fought during the war. So he had many colorful adventures, and they were having a party, and they were going to steal a boat and try to escape to Boston in a stolen boat from Governor Patterson. I won't get extensively into his story. It's in my book, a lot of it. But the point I want to make to you here is that Jupiter Wise is also an example of a slave who crossed British lines, and the British had invited American slaves if you come across British lines, you will be free. In fact, we will give you a certificate to show that you're free. So they, of course, a lot of American slaves were quite happy to do that. And Jupiter Wise is recorded in the famous Book of Negroes, which recorded those who were leaving the Loyalist side after the war, and they wanted to know who was leaving, and maybe there was some reparation had to be made later. But anyway, he was recorded having a certificate of freedom by Commander Carleton when he got to British territory. However, he was later re-enslaved, and that was a not uncommon thing. Just because you got to British territory and had a certificate from from General Birch or Governor Carleton, it didn't mean that somebody wasn't going to pick you up later before you got too far and enslave you again, and that happened in the Maritimes a number of times. And Jupiter Wise is the example here. He was on a ship called the Apollo that was, as a free man, going to Shelburne, Nova Scotia, which is documented. And then the next thing, he appears a year after George Burns returned from his service in 1784. He and Joe show up as 2 slaves of Captain Burns the year later. So I've made the inference that he had been enslaved either by Captain Burns or by someone who sold him to Captain Burns, and that's how he came to Prince Edward Island. But he had been a free former slave who was later enslaved and ended up actually being deported to the West Indies as a slave again. Thirdly, in the fifth and last person in the prominent group I'm going to mention is Joseph Smallwood, who had been a military trooper, claimed to be a disbanded trooper, asked for land on the island of St. John, and he was given some. He was said to have acquired a female slave known as Elizabeth Smallwood after he arrived on the island about 1784. He was the grandfather of the first premier of Newfoundland, Joey Smallwood, who was premier from 1949 to 1972. Dennis King's got his work cut out if he's going to catch him. Elizabeth Smallwood married Sancho Robinson, the slave of Colonel Robinson, in 1808. And actually, I find that those slaves who got married after 1800, it seemed to have been a sign of freedom. It's an indication that they had been freed before they got married. Now, in the 1798 census of St. John's Island, Edmund Fanning, Joseph Robinson, and Robert Gray are all recorded as living in Charlottetown royalty, which seems to be where the hoity-toity hung out in those days. George Burns and Joseph Smallwood are both in Lot 38 in different parts. Second group I will mention is Loyalists from Rhode Island, and they seem to have been the largest identifiable group of island loyalists who brought slaves here, which is quite appropriate since Newport, Rhode Island, was the northern center of slave trafficking across the Atlantic to America. And throughout the 18th century, there were very many ships sent across to get slaves from Africa and take them back to Newport, and they would be sold in Newport and around. Actually, the journey from West Africa, it was probably 50 days. It was a very difficult journey, and of course, in many cases, a lot of the slaves did not even survive the trip. But it was a shorter trip to Newport than to Charleston, South Carolina, which was the southern center on the eastern seaboard for slave trafficking. In this group of Rhode Island Loyalists, the primary first, and I think the highest ranking or most important, would be Thomas Hazard and his family, including his son William Hazard. They came from Newport in 1785 on 2 vessels and became established at Charlottetown and Lot 49, I'm sorry. I believe that the enslaved woman who arrived on the island of St. John with the unusual name Free Love Hazard, how do you like that one? Free Love Hazard was, I believe, from that prominent Newport slave-owning family. Thomas Hazard recorded an in-family transaction in 1802 wherein he sold a 5-year-old mulatto slave to his son William and gave a 4-year-old female slave to his 2 young granddaughters who were younger than her. So by the wording of the Baptism of Slaves Act, these 2 young children were mistresses of a slave who was about their own age. They were all children. What happened to them later, there's no indication of that. But anyway, so Thomas Hazard and family were very prominent. They had a particular business in Newport for making what was called Negro cloth, which was a cheap material that was used to sold to slave owners to clothe slaves. Secondly, in this group, Joseph Aplin was from Providence, Rhode Island, also arrived in 1785. He was prominent for a brief period as Attorney General. It's not clear if he was a slave owner, but he wrote and published in 1802 in St. John, New Brunswick, a few years after he left the island, an unusual argument that slavery was legal. It's opinions of several gentlemen of the law on the subject of Negro servitude in the province of Nova Scotia, it's called. And this, the indication at the bottom is that it was published in St. John, New Brunswick, 1802. In the upper right corner is the initial W and the name Chipman, which is, I believe, I'm pretty sure is shows that this had belonged to Ward Chipman, who was an early Chief Justice of New Brunswick, involved in some slave cases himself. So, it was reported that he had preserved the only copy of this document. But the document says that that long having since been treated as property, slaves, since slavery was not forbidden by law, and there was nothing to indicate they weren't property, as he argued, that it was legal. And although that may sound like a repugnant view in contemporary time, and it certainly is, that was really a fair statement of the state of the law in Britain and its colonies at the time. Slaves were property, and therefore, like any other piece of property, they could be bought and sold and so forth. So, Joseph Athlen, the author of this interesting pamphlet. Thirdly is Stephen Boyer, who was born in Bunbury, Cheshire, England, and then later lived in Providence, Rhode Island. I drove down the Bunbury Road to get here tonight. I drive just about every day since I live in that area. So I often think about Stephen Boyer. He later lived at Stanhope, and his son Stephen had a slave named Caesar as late as 1809. Fourthly and finally in this Rhode Island collection, William Creed from Providence, Rhode Island, like George Burns, was living on the island before the war, settling in the Three Rivers area as a merchant. So a questionable loyalist on that basis, but after the war in 1784, he brought the noteworthy slave Dimbo Suttles to the Georgetown Three Rivers area. Dimbo Suttles is, I believe, Black Sam Martin's only rival in the level of general esteem he is shown to have earned in his community during his lifetime. Dimbo and Samuel Martin are also linked by the marriage of Dimbo's eldest son John to Samuel's daughter Kissy Louisa Martin at St. Paul's on February 18th, 1835. And so I use regularly the term Black Sam to describe Samuel Martin, and I want to point out that while it is certainly a racial label, and that other people such as Black Bill and Black Jack, who were called by that name, was not done respectfully, but in the case of Samuel Martin, and maybe somewhat unique, the term Black Sam was a term of respect and affection. And in fact, there was late in his life, there was an ad that some friends put, white friends, put in the paper to get some money to help him in his old age. And it was headed Black Sam, but it was completely respectful. And of course, it's on the name Black Sam's Bridge, which was a very important location marker in Charlottetown. So I always make the distinction that when it comes to the use of calling somebody Black, Black Sam was a title of respect and honor, which you can't say certainly in other cases probably. Now, to the 1798 census records show that Thomas Hazard and Joseph Athlen were in, again, Charlottetown royalty with the bigwigs, and William Hazard in Lot 49. William Hazard ownership of land in Lot 49 left a few notes on the map, Hazard Point, although it's spelled a little differently from how he spelled his name, and his name is Bellevue, which is on Bellevue Cove, Bellevue Point, and Bellevue Road in Stratford. Also, John Boyer was in Lot 48 and William Creed in Lot 59 in the 1798 census. So my last group here is Loyalist with a connection to Bedeque. And as I pointed out, a number of these people are documented on the Bedeque Harbor Memorial Cairn, which lists an impressive number of Loyalist families who settled in this area. However, they were almost entirely free of slave owners. Among the Bedeque group, I can only offer 3 slave-holding Loyalists, one well-known, one scantily documented, and a third who came some years later. The only one listed on the memorial cairn is William Skierman. However, Isabella Robbins, the daughter of Richard Robbins, named on the cairn as well, had brought his family here, has stated that Richard Robbins, quote, kept a number of slaves at his farm near Amboy, New Jersey, but, quote, we had to quit our dear home and give up all we possessed. In other words, when they had to leave. Some of the Loyalists had to leave pretty suddenly because their neighbors were not happy with them and were basically driving them out. So the suggestion is that maybe Richard Robbins would have brought slaves to the island had he not been dispossessed of them before he left. But I noted that there will be a talk here on August the 10th about Isabella Robbins' memoir, followed by Doug Sobey speaking about the Bedeque Harbor Loyalists, so you might want to make a note of that. First and foremost, by far, of the Bedeque Loyalists with slaves is the well-known William Skierman, who was from New Rochelle, New York, where he was well and comfortably established, but had to leave. And Skierman had initially stopped at Shelburne, Nova Scotia, but left because of the unsettled situation there. They didn't do a very good job of handling the people that they had welcomed there and offered land to. And so a lot of them left, and Skierman was one. He arrived on the island in his own vessel, first moving to Tryon in the winter of 1783-84, then to Bedeque, and moved with a second wife, 5 children, and 2 slaves. With the exception of Edmund Fanning, William Skierman is the best documented Loyalist slave owner who we had on the island. In 1792, Skierman leased 350 acres on Lot 26, and he later acquired substantial properties on Lot 19 and Lot 25. In the 1798 census, William Skierman and family are recorded in Lot 26. The 2 slaves that Skierman brought to Bedeque, William Bellinger and Susanna Skierman, are perhaps the 2 best documented enslaved persons on the island of St. John. Intriguingly, I find, while the Skierman party was in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, planning its move over to the island to Tryon initially, where they spent a year before moving to Bedeque, Bill Bellinger had wanted to join the nearby free black community near Shelburne, which was called Birchtown. And, but he said he would make the trip to Tryon to help Peter Skierman with the sales. So, and certainly the recorded history was that Bellinger was also very helpful to Skierman in his first years in Tryon and Bedeque. They cut down pine trees and they had a saw pit and cut them into boards, and then they had to move around the ice to Charlottetown to sell them for necessities of life. He helped make the first home, helped Skierman build his first home in Bedeque, and was very, very important in that early pioneering times on the island for the Skiermans. But it's interesting to speculate, had Bellinger left Skierman, which he seemed to have some opportunity to do, and gone to Birchtown as a free black Loyalist, his life would have been very different from what it became on the island of St. John, where his history between 1794 and 1817 is almost entirely a record of his conviction and brutal punishment for a series of criminal offenses, basically petty theft. And the law was extremely harsh and cruel to everybody at this time, the British law that we had imported, but they seem to apply it even more robustly against black persons. And for petty thefts, he could be given 200 lashes, he could be sentenced to death, and given the benefit of clergy, which meant that you have to have tea burned in open court and drawn of your thumb, so that you could get not be hanged on this occasion, but be whipped and given other punishments instead. And the T was so that you could only get the benefit of clergy for once. But the offenses which were you were eligible to be hanged for were just absolutely shocking at the time. How minor and petty they would be. So it's interesting to think that Bellinger might have had a much better life had he managed to get to Bridgetown than he did on the island, because he had 500 lashes at one time. They were just absolutely brutal. And so, however, the other story is a bit more pleasant. The only other note I will add on William Bellinger, and it doesn't really go in here, but it's intriguing, is that on February 18th, 1802, he got a marriage license, William Bellinger and Sarah Doyle Bedeck. They were both named from Bedeck, but nothing more is known of that union. The female Skierman slave, the domestic slave, Susanna Skierman, known as Sook, unlike Bellinger, was a long-term and well-loved member of the Skierman family and her community. She was known for her singing in the North Bedeck Presbyterian Church for many years. And at the end of William Skierman's life, quite remarkably for a slaveholder, he made provision for her in his will that she could remain with the family or be given 50 pounds if she wanted to leave. At that stage of her life, setting up on her own, even with 50 pounds, didn't seem very likely. But so she did end up living with members of the family in Nova Scotia, and she was given, lifelong care, Susanna. A story told about Bill Bellinger in the early days is that he often repeated stories that he wanted to marry Sook when they were still both with Skierman. And Bill obtained Mr. Skierman's approval, but he reported that everybody willing but Sook. What are you going to do? This is said to have become proverbial, such that few Bedeck boys passed through their courtship days without being teased, is Sook willing? And I think this is a remarkable memorial to a woman who had been enslaved here. It remembers her in a context where she is desired and has the power to say no. You don't find that associated with other enslaved women, for sure. So that's rather remarkable. So getting to the second of the Bedeck group, second of three, we go from the famous to the very obscure. The number two is Mr. Heard. He was heard but not seen. And it seems remarkable that the owner of Heard's Point Wharf in Bedeck is so unknown. It was a local place name, often found in the area. There was a Heard's Point ferry between here, Bedeck there, and Summerside from a cursory search from 1879 to at least 1929, the Heard's Point ferry, and you can see it here. It shows the wharf, Heard's Point, and there's other Heard Point that seems to be unrelated, but there's Heard's Point with the wharf, with the thank you, going to Summerside ferry, and certainly other places. Yes, so it's remarkable how unknown Mr. Heard was. On the new Isabella Robbins panel here at the museum, she is portrayed at her father's grave on Heard's Point. And Meacham's Atlas, as we just looked at, showed that, wharf and point. The only reference to this alleged slaveholder named Heard is intriguing but very thin. The entry for Heard's Point in Douglas's Place Names of Prince Edward Island reads, "After a loyalist of some means who brought a slave girl with him." And nothing more is heard of that slave girl, and we don't even have Heard's first name. I'd certainly be interested to know more about Mr. Heard. He is not among the list of loyalist claimants in the Royal Gazette published in 1841. However, in the Public Archives and Records Office in Charlottetown, there's a copy of the will of Thomas Hurd, same spelling, of Stone Street, St. Luke, Chelsea Parish, Middlesex County, England, captain in His Majesty's Royal Navy. Dated 16 January 1815, his date of death was 29 April 1823, and this will includes, quote, all my property in Grenada, North America, and England. There's no estate file, so there's no inventory of this property. I don't know anymore at that point on him. The above two gentlemen were mentioned together by Summerside historian Ada MacLeod in Roads to Summerside, and I quote, there used to be a saying that William Skierman, Colonel Compton, which would be Harry Compton, and Hurd, after whom Hurd's Wharf was named, were the only gentlemen in the county because they brought family slaves with them. So then the prestige side of slavery even extended to Prince County. It wasn't just in Charlottetown around. I don't know anything against Colonel Compton as a slave owner. I don't have any information he was. He was fairly well known in his time, so he's somewhat questionable. And then I wish Ada had been a little more explicit about Mr. Hurd. And third and final one this evening, and it's even more sketchy in the Baedeker group, John Strickland. He was a disbanded soldier from Marblehead, Massachusetts. He was at the Loyalist enclave in Beaver Harbor, New Brunswick by 1783, and on the island of St. John in June 1785 when he was granted 500 acres on Lot 16. However, he bought 150 acres on Lot 26 in 1797 and appears as a resident in the 1798 census. He is a bit of a stretch, admittedly, as a Lot 26 slaveholder. However, he was the owner of a slave named Sam, whom he sold before 1802 to Thomas Wright, Surveyor General, and whom I believe to have been Black Sam Martin, who became the leader in creating the Bog community of former slaves in Charlottetown. So it's possible with the 1796 to 1802 period that Sam was with John Strickland in this area before he was sold to Thomas Wright, but it's certainly not proven. But there's a slight but intriguing link I can't resist. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your kind attention. As part of the great post-revolutionary war loyalist diaspora or migration, due to its maritime location, the island of St. John received some of the traffic from the evacuating loyalists, initially focused toward Selborne and St. John, and resulting from Patterson's proclamation. It was from these loyalist sources that the island's historical black population was created. Some of the island's enslaved population, who were relatively well known in their time, such as William Skierman's Susanna and Bellinger, left no known descendants. However, Lieutenant Governor Fanning's enslaved couples, David and Keziah Shepherd, and the East Indian Joseph and Hannah Carpenter, and Joseph Robinson's William and Amelia Byers, and William Creed's Dimbo Suckles and wife Mary, are among those whose descendants are recognized as the island's historical black population. In addition to the descendants of former island slaves, there were some, but relatively few, 19th century black immigrants to the island, mostly from Nova Scotia and the West Indies. While Loyalists came to the island of St. John with no intention to diversify our population, they made a large contribution by doing so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Are you willing to take questions?
Yes, sure.
From the floor?
I'll certainly try.
Did that slave, Stickles, he left the island, did he? Or did I hear that?
Sorry?
Stickles, did he,
Suckles.
Well, it was Suckles. The family seemed to, the late 19th century seemed to change to Sickles, but it was originally Suckles. No, Dimbo Suckles died in, I think, 1845, and his had a number of descendants who lived in Lot 59 in southern Kings, and some of them emigrated. But he didn't himself. He died on the island.
So would he be buried in Lower Montague where the slave cemetery is? Or?
He probably is. I'm not specifically sure. He probably is at Whiteman's Point area. There, yeah.
In the 1880 Meacham's Atlas, which many of you know, the Suckles name occurs on at least 3 properties in Lower Montague area on the Wim Road. So by that stage, Jimbo himself had died, but the next generation were occupying 3 properties. So if you look at Meacham's Atlas, you'll see 3 different properties and houses shown on the properties as well.
John Suckles married one of Blackstone's daughters, as I mentioned. And yeah, they were farmers. Suckles had started farming, and his sons were farmers. So there was, I guess they learned on the job after he was released. But yeah.
The shepherds that came with Fanny.
Yes.
They were by shepherd, then he must have acquired them from someone else. Do you know anything about them before they came to Prince Edward Island?
Well, in the Book of Negroes, as it's called, which is the record of all these people, not just black people, but people who were evacuating from New York, and they wanted to keep track of who was leaving and so on. There are shepherds, and I'm trying to recall. They have the people, and they say it's owned by so-and-so shepherd from so-and-so North Carolina or something. So there's a lot of owners who had the name Shepherd, and they seem to have the original spelling S-H-E-P-P-A-R-D. But they were clearly from the southern states.
There's no mention of the Provo black folks who came to the Tignish area. What do you know about them?
Well, the Prevost family was a large family at Lot 1, and it was started by one black fisherman named John Prevost. He wasn't brought here by anybody. He came in his own, but it was later, in the 19th century. They weren't here in the Revolutionary War time. He came in later, and he married an Acadian woman, and they had a very large family and a number of fishermen. And they had 2 well-known sons, little Jack Prevost and Gilles Prevost, who were both well-known fiddlers. And they intermarried with Acadian. There were no other black families in Prince County. There was, in fact, Summerside was basically devoid of black people at most periods. It's hard to find any. But you're right, the Prevosts were the black family in Lot 1 and in Prince County. They were one of the biggest black families on the island, but they were the only one in Prince County.
Jim, can I ask a question? We're going to unveil a poster, and one aspect, shown in the poster, is that in 1825 there occurred an incident, and I wonder if you could wish to elaborate on that led to the repeal of the 1781 Act.
Yes, thank you. 1781, the Baptism of Slaves Act, it outlived the actual existence of slavery on the island, because I determined that by 1810 there were no slaves left, because it was all on an individual basis. Everybody had released their slaves. I think after 1800, having slaves wasn't such a fashionable, prestigious thing to have, and I think maybe Joseph Robinson had so many slaves with so many kids that they're eating them out of house and home. I don't know. Anyway, so they all seem to have been released by 1810, just on an individual basis. And so, but the Baptism of Slaves Act was still on the books till 1825, and it had long been, people have long been wondering why it was left on the statute book so long, and in fact why in 1825 it was removed. And what I discovered had happened is that in 1824 a ship called the Grand Turk, a brigantine, came in from Bermuda, and apparently in those times in Bermuda, there were still slaves in Bermuda, and they were allowed to take shifts, as it were, or take jobs as sailors on vessels, and they could be working on vessels. And there was a slave who named Andrew Joel, who, when this bark came into the Charlottetown harbor, jumped ship. He escaped in Charlottetown, and the ship it seemed to have regularly returned to Charlottetown. It was there must have been some regular business that the captain was doing here, but it was from Bermuda. And when they came back the next time, this fellow was still around town, and the Captain Frith of the vessel was very annoyed because he seemed to be mocking and ridiculing them, and he'd gotten away, ha ha ha, you can't get it. But Captain Frith got some advice, and he found out that under the Baptism of Slaves Act, it says very specifically, if you come to Prince Edward Island as a slave, you must be freed by your master. You could not come to Prince Edward Island. Prince Edward Island was not a place for runaway slaves at all. So it said very specifically, so the Captain Frith was looking to try to use that 1781 Act 54 years later to have an order that this man be brought to him, captured, and so he could take him back. And he probably had to report to his owner in Bermuda or capture him in some fashion. So he didn't want to leave him behind. But Joel got a lawyer, James Burton Palmer, who represented several black people, and he got released because with the completion of the ship's previous voyage, his contracts had elapsed, so he was no longer under contract to the ship. But as I say, they wanted to use this provision in the Baptism of the Slaves Act that says only your master can free you if you come to BEI or ISJ as a slave. But however, it seems that it took too long for this to all happen, and the vessel probably seemed to be a deep sea working vessel, and they couldn't hang around long enough to get this all sorted out, and they left. And so the next year, by the next year, the sheriff, who was a member of the House, brought forth legislation to repeal the Baptism of the Slaves Act, and it took over a year to do it. But when they finally did, it was a very ringing denunciation of slavery as a matter of human rights and so on. And it all sounds very wonderful, except that they didn't know at the time that it was under threat of it being used in 1824 that prompted this desire to get it off the books. So that's how it was off the book. A man escaped, and actually he probably went into hiding in the bog when they were looking for him, which was the black area of West End Charlottetown. So that's how that act got changed by it was really the action of an escaped slave who changed the law.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, there are going to be two procedures. I first want to thank Jim for this very informative talk on this very delicate and not a proud part of island history from the past. And the micro grant enables us to present you with a fee for your talk, so we appreciate it, and we thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Jim. Would you like to take a chair?
Yeah, sure.
I'm just going to talk about the second part of the activity.
Can I give you this?
Yes,
Yes.
that would be fine. This would take very long.
Okay.
You're going to give me your batteries as well.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not used to being hooked up.
You're in bondage.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Well, one of the one aspect of the project that we included in the grant is something that will be permanent in the museum. And I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm going to ask you, Jim, if you will unveil
Okay.
the thing. Just sit there for a moment.
All right.
I'll get this out of the way. Yeah, if we just move it out of the way so that you can see. This panel poster, I have actually created it. So it's not an easy thing to do, but I was very reliant on and thankful for, and what sparked it, and I wouldn't have even attempted to do it without Jim's book. And Jim very kindly, he's revised the book in recent years, and it hasn't been published, the revision yet, so he loaned me his manuscript of the sections relevant to the early period. And Jim's book, the book is, it's still in, is it in print, Jim, Black Islanders, or has it been sold out completely?
It's been out of print for probably 20 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've seen that you can get it on, on Amazon and such secondhand. But without Jim's book and without Jim's research, and as you realize tonight, the amount of detail he has discovered going through legal documents, court cases, statistical records, land records, and so forth, we would know very little without Jim's research of Prince Edward Island's first black population, and a population that has left many descendants. Over the years, through intermarriage and assimilation, they sort of disappeared into the general population, but the names survive, Shepherd and Byers, and many, of course, left, like many other islanders, through outmigration, going to especially larger cities in New England, where there was, of course, a much larger black population. And one of the I've been reading a book, North to Bondage, which Jim had brought to my attention by a man called Hornby Whitfield, I think is the name. And that was, it's a very interesting read, talking about Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in particular, which allows our very little story to be compared with a much larger black population in those two provinces. And the story is somewhat similar, but in fact in much larger numbers, and actually a great deal of more resistance to law reform, or to this changing status or the freedom of slaves. There was greater resistance from landowners in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, slave owners that had slaves. So, Jim, if you can manage with,
Yeah.
we'll unveil, and Callie, if you can get a photo of this poster will be available in the museum for regular reading. The upper part tells the story of the background and the 1781 law and the 1825 repeal of the law, but the lower part tells the story of particular people, and only a selection in that small space, even the number that Jim mentioned today. But Susanna Skjorman, representative people, Susanna Skjorman, and David and Keziah Shepherd, and Samuel Martin, and Jupiter Wise, and Freelove Allen, and also the Byers family, the Suckles family here. So you can get more information there on these families. Will it be in the museum, and we will, we want to get feedback on it, and it's one of the conditions of the grant that we get feedback on the success of the project. So we'll leave the poster up here. You can come to look at it today. It will be in the museum. If you come for other talks on other nights, it will be in the Loyalist section of the museum. And we'll proceed from there. So I think, thank you, Jim. I've just got a few things which I want to say from my notes where we've gone over here. So thank you.
Thank you.
The rest standing in front of you, it's myself, and it's Prince Edward Island and the Monarchy from 1765 to the present. When the Queen died in 2022, we had just been given that summer a large number of royal portraits going back to George III, little portraits, big portraits of Queen Victoria, portraits that used to hang in island homes or in probably even within the memory of some of you here. And so I thought, well, this is a chance to show these pictures, portraits in an exhibit. And so I carried out research on many aspects of all the connections of the island, going back to the naming of the counties, the naming of the province, and also how the royal connection was celebrated in the 19th century, the King's birthday in 1802 and whatever. So it will cover aspects of, all aspects of that, and especially royal visits, starting with the famous visit in 1860 of Prince Albert Edward and a press corps trailing behind him. So right up to the present. So Prince Edward Island and the Monarchy is next week's talk. The talk following that, on the 2 weeks from today, is Prince Edward Island and the American Revolution by Jim Barbieri, who is a Vermont historian who spends the summers in Prince Edward Island, and he will talk about the island during the American Revolution and how it was affected by activities in the southern colony, in the 13 colonies. Raffle tickets and memberships, you're probably aware, are available. The raffle is a seafood raffle, and just manager. She has been with us since last October on a Young Canada Works Museum internship for 6 months, and this year we have her for at least a year under a provincial jobs scheme of 50% funding. So Kaylee has especially been involved in organizing an activity, which I'll let her tell you about. And when she has finished, there are refreshments at the back, juice and cookies. So Kaylee, I'll let you say.
I can probably project.
You may.
Yeah, I'm good at talking. Hi folks, I'm Kaylee. For those of you I haven't met, it's nice to see you. Thank you all so much for coming out. So I just wanted to tell you very quickly about our exciting festival that we're having in August. I wish I had my big poster with me, but I've got little postcards for all of you. You can take one home, stick it on your fridge so you don't forget. But August 9th to the 11th, we're having a Loyalist Heritage Festival to celebrate the 240th anniversary of the landing of the Loyalists here in Bedak. And the back of your little postcard will have all of the entire schedule for the 3 days, but I'll particularly draw your attention to the very first event and the very last event because you can book those tickets tonight. So the very first is a Loyalist supper on Friday, August 9th from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. And Roy Johnson will be playing live music during the supper, and it's a really good menu, a full traditional turkey supper, turkey, stuffing, gravy, vegetables, and the most important part is strawberry shortcake for dessert with fresh picked strawberries by these lovely ladies. Irene is over there. So you certainly don't want to miss out on that, and you can book your tickets right here.
And it's in the United Church, isn't it?
Yes, in the United Church, that's right. So just up the road, very handy to hear. And the last event, which I'll also draw your attention to, is Sunday, August 11th. from 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. And Richard Wood has agreed to play a concert for us at the Canada Club in Kincora. You'd be hard pressed to find someone on the island or probably even globally in the fiddle community who doesn't know of Richard. So you certainly don't want to miss that as well. So you can book your tickets and please grab a little postcard on your way out so you don't forget about our event. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kaylee. Well, thank you all for coming. We're very pleased to have a full house again. And have a refreshment at the back, a cookie and a glass of juice. And Mix and Jim, I'm sure, will be available to answer questions.